Hey, this is Justin, and welcome to part 10 in the point-and-click adventure game tutorial series for Unreal. And this video focuses on the first part of the dialogue system that we will be implementing. This is mainly going to be setting up the UI and the NPC and everything before we get into the real logic of the conversation or dialogue system. So let's get started, and then we'll complete the logic and stuff in the next video. So first, in the textures folder, we're going to create a new folder called NPCs, and we'll drag in that blinking eyes image, which can be found in the assets zip file in the description. And we're going to right click, go to Sprite Actions, apply Paper 2D texture settings, and then go to Sprite Actions again, and we'll extract the sprites, switch the mode to grid, and the cell width to 18. And that should split them up evenly. I'm just going to select the last three images for now and create a flipbook, and I'll call it FB_blinking eyes. And then I'll set the frames per second to something like 3 maybe. Extend the first one a few frames so the eyes stay open for a while. Actually, a higher frames per second might be better, something like 8. And then if I duplicate the half closed section and I move it to the end, it looks like he's opening his eyes back up. Actually, maybe 12 might be better frames per second. Yeah, I think that'll be fine. This is just a temporary filler animation. You can do any animation you want for this or any sort of combination of those frames. So now I'm going to open up the tower interior because I want to place the eyes into this little hole I drew on the wall here. However, I need to create the NPC. So in the blueprints folder, I'm going to create a new blueprint class, and I'm going to select the hotspot blueprint as the base. And I'm going to call this BP_NPC. And then if I open it up, I can add a component, and I'm going to add the flipbook, paper flipbook component. I'll call it NPC flipbook. And then I'll add another one, a sphere collision, and I'll name this bark position. And I'll switch it to top and make sure it's on lit. And for the default flipbook, I'll just select the temp guy idle down. I'll switch it to -90 on the X rotation, and I'll move it up a bit. And then for the bark position, I'll change the sphere radius to 4 and just move it above his head. And then I'm going to add a variable, and I'm going to call it NPC default flipbook. And I'm going to switch the type to flipbook. And then I'll make that public. And then I'll make another variable called text color, make it public also, and then switch it to the color struct. And then in the construction script, I'll drag out the NPC flipbook, and then from that, I'll set the flipbook to the variable. Cool. So now if we ever set that in the details panel, it'll just update. So I'm going to create a new blueprint, and it's going to be based off of NPC, and I'm going to call it BP_NPC eyes. So now when I open up this blueprint, I make sure that the class defaults tab is set, and then I can set these default variables, like for instance, the default flipbook will be the blinking eyes flipbook we made earlier. And then I can move it down to be right in the middle, and I'll move the bark position to be slightly above that. Now back in the class defaults, I can fill in the rest of this info, like the hotspot description. I'll just say is eyes in the hole. Facing direction will be left. And then I can change the bark color to be maybe purple. And then the walk to position will have to be edited in the scene. So let's open up the level for the tower interior. And then we'll drag in our blueprint for the eyes. And then we can set the walk to position to somewhere the player can actually get to. Something like 20 on the Y and -6 on the X. All right, now we can switch back to the adventure data level, and we can move on towards changing some things in the adventure controller. So for the dialogue system to really work well, we have to set up the player's bark to be able to take in multiple lines. So let's rename the task bark to task single player bark. Then we can move these down and add another custom event that we're going to call task player bark. And this one will take an input of text, but instead of a single variable, it will take in an array of text. And we will call this bark array. And this is mainly because if the player says maybe 2 lines, we want 1 line to show and then go away and show the next line. So let's unhook everything from the task single player bark. And what we'll want to do first is head over to the adventure character blueprint. And then what we'll do in here is create a new variable. And this will be called bark array. And we set it to the type text and make sure it is set to an array. And then we'll create another variable. We'll call this current response index, and it will be a single variable of the type integer. Now I'm just going to kind of arrange this stuff into a category called dialog, and I'll put bark array, response index, and bark color in there. Now I'm going to create another variable. I'll call this active conversation NPC, and we'll switch the type to the BP underscore NPC, and I'll move it into the dialog category also. Now I'm going to create a new function that I'm going to call add a single line to bark array, and then another function that's called add bark array. And all these will do is set this bark array variable to whatever text the player is going to be barking. So if I have an input in the add bark array of the type text array, I could just immediately set it and then clear the bark right after that. And then in the add single line to bark array, we can bring in that bark array, and we will bring in an input of a single text parameter. And then from that, we will make an array and then set the bark array with that result. But first, we will clear the bark. Now back in the adventure controller, we can actually run both of these functions depending on the event that's being fired. So add single line to bark array will be the task single player bark function, and then add bark array will be the task player bark function. Both of these should be connected to the player character reference. And then we will run the player bark function, and we don't even need to pass in any bark text to this because the bark array is the variable that will store that text. So back on the event graph of the adventure character blueprint, let's unhook the increment task index here. And from that clear bark function, we're just going to run a short delay, and we can keep the time of the duration to 0.2. And then we're going to run this player bark function again. But let's rename the player bark to something like player bark sequence. And now if we open that up, we can remove this input. We don't need it anymore, because what this will do is run over and over again until we are done speaking each line in the bark array. So if we go back to the adventure controller and compile, you'll see there is one node that needs to be fixed, and this is the combine inventory function that has this. So we want to unhook this, and then we'll just run the task single player bark event here, and then we can connect the text to bark up to the bark text input. Back over in the player bark sequence function on the adventure character, let's unhook the input at the beginning, but we also do want to check if we're barking. So unhook the branch for the is barking and move that near the beginning. Otherwise, we can delete these reroute nodes and kind of just move this stuff off to the side for now. So now I'm going to try to focus on what the player bark sequence does so that we can say multiple lines if there are multiple lines to say. So if it is false and we are not barking, the first thing we're going to do is set the current response index to 0. And then we'll set is barking to true. So then we can grab this bark section where we add the bark, we do the bark time, and then run the bark delay event, and we'll move to that section after we set is barking to true. So if the player bark sequence is running and it's the first time we enter this function, then we will set the response index to 0, is barking to true, and add that bark and do the first line of the bark, which then runs the timeline, clears the bark, delays, and runs this sequence again. So then, if we are barking and we have 2 lines, we've already ran that false line, and now we come back in and we are still barking. So what we need to do is increment this current response index, because what this will read is where on the bark text array we are currently at. So if we've already done that bottom row, we're now moving on to the second entry in the bark array. However, we need to make sure that there is a second entry. So drag in the bark array, and then we'll get the length. and we'll compare to see if the length is equal to our increased response index. So for instance, if we only have one bark in this bark array, it is now equal to the length, and the character has nothing more to say. However, if it's not equal to the length, that means we have another line to say. So then that would mean false, it's not equal to the length. So let's increase that current response index by 1, clear the bark, and then run the add bark section down here again. So just to recap, if a player starts barking, we check if they are currently barking. If it's false, we set the response index to 0. We set is barking to true. We add the bark. We set the bark time. We run bark delay, which runs through the bark timeline. When the timeline's over, it clears the bark. It waits 0.2 seconds, and then it runs the player sequence again, which now we are barking, so it goes up to the top. It checks the length to the current response index. And then if it's false, meaning we still have more to say, it increases the response index and then clears the bark and starts the process again until we have reached the end of the bark array. So if the branch is true, meaning we're at the end, we can clear the bark, we can set is barking to false, and then we can grab the increment task index and actually use that in here. The only other thing we need to do is send out an event dispatcher that we're going to call finished talking. And we can call this event at the end. And this way we know when we're done talking and the NPC knows when to respond. The only other thing we need to do now is actually add in the text that we're saying. So drag in the bark array here at the bottom, and we're going to get a copy at the current response index and pass that in to both the bark text on the add bark node and the get bark time bark text input. Now we can just test to make sure that the player still barks, and it looks like he is still responding. However, if you use two verbs one after another, it doesn't show the second one, but that's an easy fix. I think the problem lies with this is barking bool because it's not being set back to false in order to run the initial function. So what we'll do in the add single line to bark array is we'll just set is barking to false, and then we'll copy that and paste it in the add bark array function 2, so that anytime a bark initially occurs, we set barking back to false. Now if we test it out and interrupt a bark with another action, it will override that bark and show the new one. Now let's try testing real quick to see multiple lines being barked one after another. So if we open up maybe the blueprint for the pickup knife, we can just override the event on look at, and we'll just face the hotspot. And then what we'll want to do is get the adventure controller, because we want to run the task player bark. And what we'll do is clear the verb at the end, but we need to create a text array real quick. So if we use a node called make literal text, we can type in whatever we want. So I'll just say wow, and then I'll copy and paste, and I'll do a new line that says something like looks like a sharp knife. And then from the return value, I can make an array, and then I can add another pin, and now I link them together, and you hook that up to the bark array input, and that should work. So let's see what happens when we look at the pickup knife. It says wow, it goes away, and it comes back, and it says looks like a sharp knife. So that is kind of the idea with this bark array, and it's going to be useful when we do the actual dialogue. So we can delete that override in the pickup knife, and then we can get moving on. Now let's make some UI elements. So in the UI folder inside the textures, we're going to drag in our response bullet image and make sure that you apply the paper 2D settings for that. And that's all we'll need to do for that. And then in the widgets folder for the blueprints, let's create a new widget blueprint. We'll call it WBP_player prompt, and then we can open that up. So the first thing we'll do is set this to desired size. And then on the left side, we will wrap the canvas panel with the size box, and we'll override the width, and we'll set that to 320. Next, we can remove that canvas panel, And instead, we're going to look for the overlay and drag that into the size box. And then we're going to look for the horizontal box and drag that on top of the overlay. Next, we want to drag an image under the horizontal box, and we'll find our bullet. Cool. Now let's change the color for the bullet to be the darker color that we have saved. And we'll rename this image to prompt bullet. And also make sure that horizontal alignment is left and the vertical alignment is top. Next, we can drag the text element into the horizontal box so it's to the right of the bullet. And we'll set the size to 9 and choose the pixel font. And we set the color again to the darker orange. And if you look for the shadow offset, set that to 0. And change the padding on the top to -2. And while we're here, let's add 1 to the bottom. Also, be sure to set the size from auto to fill. Also, select the horizontal box and select the horizontal fill alignment, but then align it vertically to the top. Next, we want to look for a size box, and we'll put it on top of the overlay so that it goes under the horizontal box. And we'll add a button to this size box. And the only thing we want to do with the size box is change the width to 320, but make sure you check that height override, but leave it at 0. Because if we horizontally stretch and vertically stretch, it should fill everything. And if you turn off that height override, for some reason it gets larger than what we want. Now, with the button selected, we're going to clear the styles for the normal, hovered, and pressed by changing the Draw As dropdown to none. Now, with the text selected, in the Appearance section, you have to click that little arrow at the bottom for the additional options, because we need the line height percentage. And we're going to change that to 0.75. And that should bring everything up so there's about a pixel width at the bottom of the text. And we can rename this button to prompt button, and we'll rename the text to prompt text. And make sure that the text is a variable as well as the button and the prompt bullet. Now we're going to create a new widget blueprint called WBP_prompt list. And the first thing we'll do is wrap the canvas panel with an overlay, and we can delete the canvas panel then. And then we will add an image to the overlay and stretch it to fill, change it to black, and then we'll add a size box on the overlay also, and make sure that the width override is 320 and the height override is 56. And if you switch it to desired, you'll see kind of what it will look like. And it might be better to just wrap the overlay in a size box and do the same thing. So width is 320 and height is 56. And then that image we can rename to prompt list BG. And then we can search for a vertical box to drag onto the overlay so that it is underneath the BG image. And then we can stretch to fill on the horizontal and vertical. Next, we can drag our player prompt widgets into the vertical box. And let's add a 1 pixel pad to the top, left, and right of this vertical box. And then I want to rename each of these prompts to a sequential naming convention. So it'll be from the top down. We'll just say prompt 1, prompt 2, prompt 3, prompt 4, and prompt 5. And I'm just going to put 5 in there because I don't really think that we'll have more than 5 options to choose at any given time. And then I'm going to select 2 through 5 and skip the first one, and then just add 1 pixel of padding to the top so it separates them a little bit. Cool, now let's just open the HUD widget, and we're just going to add this new widget in here. But what I want to do is select this overlay that is underneath the UI, and I'm going to wrap it with a widget switcher. And then in the widget switcher, I'll have the UI area, and then below that, the prompt list. And now we can switch back and forth between the two. And I'm going to rename the prompt list just to prompt list, so it's an easier variable to work with. Now in the player prompt widget blueprint, let's select the button, and we'll add the events for on clicked, on hovered, and on unhovered. And then we can delete the other nodes here in the event graph. We won't need those. Now let's add a function that we'll call setText. And for this one, we're just going to add an input parameter of the type text, and we'll call it text to set. And then at the beginning, we'll set the visibility to visible. The target is self. And then we'll just drag in the prompt text variable, and from that, we'll set the text, and then link up the text to set to the inText parameter. Next, we'll make another function, and this one will be called highlight text. And so we'll just drag in the prompt bullet and the prompt text. And from the text reference, we're going to get the set color and opacity node. And then from the bullet, we're going to get the set brush tint color node. And then we can split both of these structs, and we'll select the highlighted color for both of these. And if you don't remember what that is, it's D79115FF, and that's for the hex sRGB box. And then we just link these up, and that's all we'll need to do in this. And then we'll create another function, and this one will be called reset text color. And this will set it back to whatever base color it is. So let's create a new variable of the type Boolean, and we'll call it has been used. And then we'll basically do exactly what highlight text does, except for if it's false, we're going to be setting the color to the saved dark color. And if you don't remember what that is, the hex sRGB is 7652AFF. And then we'll just create a darker version of that color up here. And I'm going to use 58471BFF, and then I'll drag it up to the top to save it. Now make one more function, and we'll call this one hide prompt. And all this function is going to do is first clear the text for the prompt text variable by setting the text to nothing. And then it's going to set the visibility of the widget to hidden. Now back in the event graph, we can just finish these functions here. And onClicked is going to notify something else that it has been clicked. So we'll create an event dispatcher called prompt clicked and call it when the onClicked function is called. For the onHovered event, we're going to highlight the text. And for the onUnhovered event, we're going to reset the text color. And that's all really that this widget blueprint is going to do. Now over in the prompt list, let's create a new variable that we'll call prompt entries. And all it is a player prompt array. So make sure you set it from single variable to array. And we can remove everything except for the event construct. And what we'll do is first clear the prompt entries. Probably don't need to, but it's always good practice. And then we'll just go through each of the prompts and add them to the array. All right, with that done, we'll create a new function, and we'll call this hide player prompts. And all it's going to do is run a for each loop through the prompt entries and set them to be hidden. So we'll run the hide prompt for each. Then we'll create another function and call it set prompt text. And what this is going to do is take in a few parameters, and the first one will be an integer that we're going to call row index. The next one will be a Boolean, and we'll call that has been selected. And then the third parameter will be text to bark, and the type will be text. Then drag in the prompt entries, and we're going to get the prompt entry at the row index. And then we're going to set has been used. So the bool on the player prompt is going to be set to the has been selected bool. And then we'll reset the text color so that it is set to the color it should be depending on whether or not it has been used. And then we'll set the text of the player prompt using the text to bark that we're passing in. Now with the widgets done, we can go back to the blueprints folder and we'll add a folder called dialog. And in here, we'll create a new struct and it will be called st_prompt data. And this is going to hold all of the information that the player will use when they select a prompt from the prompts list. So depending on what they select here, it will read all of this information and do what it needs to do. So for the first variable, we'll make it an integer and we'll call it prompt number. And then we'll make another integer and call it the prompt sub number. Then we'll add a Boolean called visible, which determines whether or not it should show up. And then we'll create another Boolean called has been selected, and this is to determine what color the text needs to be. And then we'll create another Boolean called single use, whether or not it goes away after you select it once. And then we'll create an array of text called player prompt and another array of text called NPC response. Then we'll create a data table reference, so a single variable, and look for data table, and we'll call it switch topic. Then another Boolean called ends conversation, whether or not the dialogue is over after we use this prompt. And lastly, a string variable called event. And that's to pass in a string and then read it in whatever blueprint we want to determine what we do. Then we'll add another struct and we'll call it st_conversation data. And all it is an array of prompt data. And we'll call this variable conversation prompt array. And this will be the data that an NPC might have that will tell the save game object all of the information that we need to keep track of. Now we're going to create a data table. It's under miscellaneous, and we'll select our prompt data structure. And you can call this whatever you want, but I'm going to call it dt_ eyes in wall _ topic 01. So every data table, I'm going to call a topic. And so I'm splitting up the prompts based on which data table or topic is active. This helps me kind of visualize a little better what the player should say and how the NPC should respond based on what prompts are active. So I'm just going to turn up this widget reflector a little bit so you can kind of see the information I'm going to be passing into this data table. So hopefully it's not so confusing. You'll see when we actually start using this data table later more about kind of how this is going to be used, and it should make sense. So let's create a new row, and we'll rename it 1 because it's the first row. And I'm going to separate these tabs a smidge so we can just read these a little better. So for the first entry, we're going to set the prompt number to 1. And for the prompt sub number, we're going to leave it at 0. For visible, we'll say that it is visible. Has been selected will not need to be altered in here. Single use, we're going to leave it false, so we can say it multiple times. And then we'll add one element to this player prompt array, and this is the thing that the player is going to bark when you select it. And it's also going to be the text of the prompt. We'll say, who are you? So now that the player prompt has been typed in, we need to type the NPC response. What's the NPC going to say? So for this one, I'll just have him say, don't concern yourself with who I am. And then I'll add another entry so that he says something after this, which might be something like, it's not important. Cool. So now if I drag this tab out a little bit, you can see it's 2 lines here separated by a comma, but both of them are surrounded by quotation marks. Next, we can look at the switch topic section. We're not going to switch a topic with this, and it's not going to end the conversation, and there's not going to be any special events. Cool. We have 1 prompt now, but let's add some more. We'll add another one, and the prompt number for this one will be 2. The sub number will be 0. Visible, yes, it'll be visible. Has not been selected. We're not going to mess with that. It's not single use. And so the player will say, how did you get in there? And you know what? Let's make it single use just to demonstrate. For the NPC response, he'll say, in here. And then maybe he'll say something else like, how did you get in there? Or maybe out there makes more sense. All right. So for the switching topics, we don't need to switch topics for this one. Maybe capitalize there, keep it consistent. And then we don't need to end the conversation or have an event. And we'll rename this row to 2. The row names will all be basically the same number as the row. So for the third one, we're going to change the prompt number to 3. Sub number, keep it at 0. And we're going to do visible and single use. And the player prompt will be, I have some questions about this temple. And then the NPC might respond with, shoot. So now the idea is we're going to switch to a new topic. So let's create another data table. It's under miscellaneous and data table. And make sure you select the struct of the prompt data. And we'll call this dt underscore Eisenwall underscore topic 02. Though you could just rename these to be the topic that you're talking about. But instead of like topic 02, I could say something like topic underscore tower. And then for the other one, I could say topic underscore intro. And that way it's a little less robotic. And so for this third row, which we should probably rename to 3, we want to switch the topic to our tower topic. So now when you select this topic, it'll switch. After the NPC says shoot, it'll switch to the new topic and show new prompts. But we should probably change the word temple to tower because that's confusing. So let's add another row and we'll rename it to 4 and make sure the prompt number is also set to 4. They don't always need to be the same, but in this case they are. And we want this to be visible and we want this to be single use. But we don't want number 3 to be single use, so let's make sure that that's ticked to false. Now back on number 4, we're going to add a player prompt element. And we'll have the character say something like, what's your favorite color? And then the NPC might say blue. Now, the thing about the sub number is that if we made another row, and we named it 5 because it's the 5th, we could change the prompt number to keep it at 4, right? The same as the one above it. But if we change the sub number to 1, that means we're going to move to this one after we use the last one. So we don't want to set it to visible. And again, don't mess with the has been selected. And we'll make it single use. And for the player prompt, we'll say, what do you like to do for fun? The NPC might say, look through holes. And then it doesn't end the conversation or switch topics. So for this prompt number 4, first we're asking what the favorite color is. He responds. And then the new prompt comes up that says, what do you like to do for fun? He says, look through holes. And then we'll add a new row. And we'll name it 6. And then we'll set the prompt number to 4 again. And this time the sub number will be 2. And it won't be visible, it won't be selected, and we will say it's single use, and we'll just have the character or the player say, what's your favorite book? And then the NPC might respond, the thesaurus. And then we don't need to switch topics. It won't end the conversation, and there's no events. So let's add one more row here, and this will be number 7. And then this will be prompt number 5, which is the next in the list. We will say it is visible. We won't have it be single use, and the player will say, I think I've seen quite enough. Goodbye. And then the NPC will say, bye. And this will end the conversation. And it looks like the NPC responses didn't save, so I'm just going to type those back in. Blue is his favorite color. He likes to look through holes for fun. And his favorite book is The Thesaurus. You just have to hit enter to make sure that those get saved. And now we need to figure out the other topic, which is the data table for the tower topic. So if we open that up, we can just add a few filler entries here. So the first one we will rename to 1. And this stuff can be tedious, but it's important to spend a lot of time on dialogue because that really helps the player feel immersed. So for the first one, we'll say that it's visible, and the player will ask, how tall is the tower? And the NPC might say, I'm not good with measurements. And then after that, he'll say, but maybe 2.5 feet. And then maybe another row, rename that to 2. Prompt number will be 2. Sub number will be 0. It's visible. And the player will ask, when was this tower constructed? NPC might say, yesterday, I think. And then we'll add one more choice. Number 3, prompt number 3. And that's visible. And the player will say, what color is this tower? And the NPC will say, I don't know, gray, grayish blue. And it won't end the conversation or switch topics. And then we'll do a final one which actually goes back to the previous topic. So we'll rename this to 4. Prompt number will be 4. Visible, not single use. And the player will say, I'm done asking questions about this tower. And the NPC will say, finally. And that will not end the conversation, but it will switch the topic back to the intro. So now that we have the data tables ready and all the information that we need for a conversation, we just need to code the actual logic that will go into creating this conversation. And that is going to be done in the next video because it is quite a bit to go through, and I want to make sure I'm taking the time and not rushing it. So thank you for watching this video. Please like, please subscribe, do the notification bell thing. I hear it's really fun, and I'll see you in the next one.